The first thing Mae Underwood heard about Abel Keene was that he had once made a grown man cry in the middle of Harlan's general store over a debt of 47 cents, and that was considered one of his kinder moments. She had arrived in Cassidy Flats, Texas, on the 3rd of September, 1882, with a carpetbag that smelled of cedar and lavender, a worn Bible her mother had pressed into her hands at the train station in Missouri, and exactly $11 to her name. The stage had left her at the edge of town because the driver said the road past the church was too rutted for the axle, and so she had walked the rest of the way with dust coating her boots and the late afternoon sun pressing down on her shoulders like a reproach. She was 24 years old, newly widowed, though widowed felt like too large a word for what she had been left with, which was a cold stove, an empty pantry, and a husband who had been dead of fever for 6 weeks and had owed money to half the county before he went. She had sold everything she could sell, paid what she could pay, and then taken the stage west because her cousin Dora had written to her and said that a town like Cassidy Flats had work for a woman who was willing to work hard and ask few questions. Dora had not been wrong. The town had work. It had a rooming house run by a widow named Mrs. Pell who charged fair rates and kept a clean kitchen. It had a schoolhouse that needed a teacher 2 days a week. It had a laundry that needed an extra pair of hands on Tuesdays and Fridays. Mae set about making herself necessary within the first week, because she had learned early that necessity was the closest thing to security a woman could build for herself when she was starting from nothing. It was Mrs. Pell who first mentioned Abel Keene. They were sitting at the kitchen table on Mae's 4th evening in town, sharing a pot of coffee that was too strong and too hot but welcome all the same, and Mae had asked in her straightforward way about the ranches she could see from the rise behind town. There were 3 of them visible from that high ground, their fences and outbuildings spread like dark stitching across the golden grass of the Texas plains. "The one on the far east is the Donnelly spread," Mrs. Pell had said, wrapping both hands around her cup. "Good people. Tom Donnelly will give you the shirt off his back if he thinks you need it. His wife Alina makes the best apple cake in 3 counties. She paused and something shifted in her expression. "The one in the middle, the biggest one, the one with the dark painted barn, that is the Keene Ranch, Abel Keene's place." Mae had waited because there was clearly more coming. "You stay away from that one," Mrs. Pell said, and her voice had gone flat and certain in the way that voices went when they were not offering advice but delivering fact. "Abel Keene is the cruelest rancher in 3 counties, has been since his father died and left him that land. He runs his men like animals. He drove the Hargrove family off their homestead 2 years back because one of their fence posts was 8 inches over the property line. 8 inches, me. I measured it myself. And he took them to the county judge and had them removed. Mrs. Hargrove had 3 children under the age of 5. He did not blink." Mae had absorbed this the way she absorbed most difficult information, quietly and without visible reaction, filing it away in the drawer of her mind where she kept things that were important to remember. "I will stay away from his ranch," she said simply, and she had meant it. She had meant it entirely. It was the horses that changed things, because it was always something specific and unplanned that changed things, never a grand decision. 3 weeks into her time in Cassidy Flats, on a bright Tuesday morning when the sky was the particular shade of blue that made the whole world look freshly washed, Mae was walking the road between town and the Donnelly ranch. Alina Donnelly had offered her work mending harnesses and linens, and Mae had accepted because $11 had become $6, and the arithmetic of survival did not wait for sentiment. She was on the road when she heard the sound. It came from the east, from the direction of the Keene property, and it was the sound of a horse in distress. A high, panicked calling that cut right through the morning quiet and landed in Mae's chest like a hand gripping her heart. She had grown up around horses. Her father had been a farrier in Missouri before his back went, and she had spent her childhood learning to read the language of horses the way other children learn to read books. She followed the sound without making a conscious decision to follow it, pushing through the dry grass at the edge of the road, and climbing the low wooden fence that marked the border of the Keene property, because the sound was urgent, and she was a woman who could not hear an animal in pain and keep walking. The horse was in a shallow ditch that ran along the interior fence line, a bay mare that had gone down into the ditch and gotten one of her front legs caught in old, half-buried wire fencing. She was thrashing, which was making everything worse, and the wire was cutting into her fetlock with each movement. Mae did not think about the property line. She did not think about Abel Keene. She went over the second fence with the same brisk efficiency with which she did everything and was at the horse's head in under a minute, kneeling in the dirt and placing both hands on the mare's nose, pressing gently, speaking in the low, continuous murmur that her father had taught her. "Easy now, easy. I am here. I am not going to hurt you. You are all right. You are going to be all right." The horse stilled, not completely, but enough. Mae kept her hands steady and her voice low and kept talking. And after what felt like a long time but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, the mare's breathing slowed and the wild rolling of her eyes softened into something more frightened than frantic. It was in that moment of relative stillness that Mae became aware of the sound of hoofbeats approaching from across the field, and she looked up to see a rider coming fast, a man on a black horse, riding with the kind of controlled urgency that suggested he had been watching from a distance and had only now decided to intervene. He pulled up about 10 feet away and dismounted in one fluid motion, and Mae got her first proper look at Abel Keene. He was tall, genuinely tall, not the kind of tall that men invented for themselves, with dark hair that had gone a little long under his hat, and the kind of face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something angular and hard-edged. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two more, with dark eyes that were currently fixed on the trapped mare with an expression that Mae had not expected. He looked afraid, not angry, which was what she had braced for, not cold and calculating, which was what Mrs. Pell's description had prepared her for. He looked like a man who was watching something he cared about deeply in a situation he could not immediately fix, and that fear was written plainly across his face for the 2 seconds before he noticed me kneeling beside the horse, and his expression closed up like a shutter being drawn. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was low and even not raised, which somehow made it more commanding than shouting would have been. "Mae Underwood. I heard her from the road. She has wire caught around her left foreleg." Mae kept her hands on the horse's nose. "I need something to cut it. Do you have wire cutters?" A pause, during which he looked at her with the particular expression of a man who was accustomed to being the one who issued instructions and was recalibrating. "On my saddle," he said. "Then get them, please. She is calm right now, but she will not stay that way." He got them. He came to the ditch and went down into it beside the mare's trapped leg, and Mae watched his hands as he worked careful, deliberate hands, checking the wire before cutting it so it would release cleanly rather than snap back and cause more injury. He knew what he was doing. She noted this without surprise, because knowing what you were doing around animals was not the same as being a good person, and she was not confused about that. He cut the wire in 3 places and freed the leg, and together, without discussion, just by reading each other's movements the way people who know horses learn to do, they guided the mare up out of the ditch and onto level ground. Mae ran her hands down the freed leg while the horse stood trembling, checking the cuts, checking the way the mare bore weight. "Not deep," she said. "The cuts are not deep. She will need the leg cleaned and wrapped, but nothing is broken." He was standing very still, watching her examine the horse, and when she looked up at him his expression was something she could not immediately name. It was not quite gratitude. It was not quite suspicion. It was something in between, layered over something else she could not reach. "You know horses," he said. "My father was a farrier." "Where are you from?" "Missouri. I am staying with Mrs. Pell. I was on my way to the Donnelly Ranch." Something crossed his face at the mention of the Donnellys, quick and unreadable, and then it was gone. "This is my property," he said, and his voice had gone to the flat note again, the note Mrs. Pell had described. "You crossed 2 fences." Mee stood up, brushing dirt from her skirt with both hands, and looked at him directly in the way that she had learned made some men uncomfortable but that she had never been willing to stop doing. "I did," she said. "I heard your mare in distress and I came to help her. If you would like to have me removed from your property for that, you are welcome to try." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. He looked at her for a long moment, and Mee looked back without flinching, and then something happened to the line of his mouth, not quite a softening, but a change, as though a very slight internal tension had released. "She is my best breeding mare," he said, and there was something raw in those 6 words that did not match everything Mrs. Pell had told her. "She will be fine," Mee said. "Clean the wounds twice a day and keep her in the paddock close to the barn for a week. She will be fine." He nodded once. Then he looked at her again, and this time the look lasted long enough to make Mee's pulse do something she would rather it had not. "I will ride you to the Donnelly Road," he said, "since you came through my property." "That is not necessary." "I know it is not necessary. I will do it anyway." She looked at him for another moment, then accepted, because she was practical and the gesture was a straightforward one. She walked beside his black horse while he led it, the bay mare following on a loose lead behind them, and they did not talk much on that walk, but the silence between them was not hostile. It was the silence of 2 people who were paying careful attention to each other without wanting to admit it. He left her at the Donnelly fence line, gave a brief nod, and rode back toward his own land, and Mee watched him go longer than she needed to before turning toward the Donnelly house. She told herself it was because she was making sure the bay mare was walking cleanly. She was mostly wrong about that. She did not see him again for 9 days, and in those 9 days she heard 3 more stories about Abel Keene that confirmed everything Mrs. Pell had originally told her. She heard from Tom Donnelly that Abel had shut down access to the creek crossing that had served both their properties for 20 years because of some legal dispute about water rights, forcing the Donnelly cattle to walk an extra mile in summer heat. She heard from the schoolchildren, who repeated things they overheard at home, that Abel Keene had dismissed 3 of his ranch hands the previous winter without notice and without the wages they were owed. She heard from the woman who ran the laundry, a capable and observant person named Clementine Hayes, that Abel Keene had not been seen in the Cassidy Flats church in 2 years, and that the Reverend himself had said the man had no soul worth saving. Mee filed all of this away and was careful about what she made of it, because she had learned that the loudest stories about a person and the truest stories about a person were frequently not the same story, and she was also still thinking about the look on his face when he had come riding across that field toward his trapped mare. He did not look like a man who had no soul. She was not sure what he looked like yet. She needed more evidence. The evidence arrived unexpectedly on a Wednesday afternoon in late September when Mee was walking back from the schoolhouse, and a rider came up beside her on the road, slowing to match her pace, and she looked up to find it was Abel Keene on his black horse. "Miss Underwood," he said. "Mr. Keene. The mare is well. I am glad to hear it." He was quiet for a moment, riding beside her at her walking pace, which looked faintly ridiculous from a distance, a man on horseback walking slowly beside a woman on foot, but he seemed either not to notice or not to care. "I owe you for what you did," he said finally. "I would have lost her in another 10 minutes. She would have broken the leg fighting the wire. You do not owe me anything. I did what needed doing." "Still," he said, "I owe you." Mee looked up at him. The afternoon light was coming from the west, and it caught the angles of his face in a way that made him look younger than he had in the shadow and stress of the ditch. There were lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, and something behind those eyes that was careful and contained, and she thought, deeply tired. "How long have you been running that ranch alone?" she asked, because the question arrived in her mind and she asked it before she thought better of it. He looked at her sharply. "Since my father died, 7 years. That is a long time." "Yes," he said, and the word came out with a weight to it that told her it had been a longer 7 years than most people would understand. They walked together the rest of the way to the edge of town, and she asked him questions about the ranch, practical questions about the cattle, the water, the land. And he answered them with the measured carefulness of a man who was not accustomed to being asked. He knew his land the way a scholar knows his subject, thoroughly, and with a precision that came not from showing off but from genuine attention over many years. He knew which pastures went dry first in summer. He knew the temperament of every horse in his string. He knew the yield of every acre of hay. When they reached the edge of town, he stopped and she stopped, and there was a brief, slightly awkward pause that felt like the pause at the end of something that both people have found more enjoyable than they expected. "Thank you for the company," Mae said, because it was true. He looked at her for a moment with that same layered expression she had noticed by the ditch. Then he touched the brim of his hat in the way men did when words were not quite available, and he turned his horse and rode back the way they had come. Mae stood at the edge of town for a moment looking after him. Clementine Hayes came out of the laundry just then and followed Mae's gaze down the road to the retreating rider and said, very dryly, "That is Abel Keene." "I know," Mae said. "You know what they say about him." "I know what they say," Mae agreed. "I'm not sure all of it is the whole truth." Clementine gave her a long look that was not unsympathetic. "You be careful, Mae Underwood," she said, but there was something in her voice that was less warning than curiosity. The weeks that followed were an education. Abel Keene began appearing on the road between town and the Donnelly Ranch with a regularity that could not entirely be explained by ranching business. And Mae, who traveled that road 3 times a week, began to encounter him with a regularity that could not entirely be explained by coincidence. They rode or walked together for whatever stretch of road their paths shared, and they talked. They talked about horses, which was the territory they had both been comfortable with from the start. They talked about the land, which Abel could discuss with genuine eloquence once he was drawn out of his habitual silence. They talked about Missouri, which Mae described with a fondness that surprised even her, because she had not thought she was homesick until she found herself describing the way the light looked over the river in late afternoon. He told her almost nothing about himself, not directly, but Mae was observant, and she learned him by accumulation. She learned that he rose before dawn every day regardless of the season, and that this was not discipline but habit, because he had learned to love the hour before the world woke up when everything was still. She learned that he had a younger sister named Ruth who lived in San Antonio with her husband and wrote to him infrequently, and that the infrequency pained him more than he would say. She learned that he ate every meal alone at a table that was made for 6, because his father had built that table expecting a large family and the family had not materialized. She also learned, gradually and sideways, about the stories she had heard. The Hargrove fence dispute was real, but the version she had heard was incomplete. What she had not been told was that the Hargroves had been deliberately encroaching on the property line for 2 years, and that Abel had spoken to them 4 times privately before the legal action, and that the legal action itself had resulted in a settlement that gave the Hargroves more than their 8-inch fence post, but required them to move their structure. They had left the area not because they were ruined, but because they were embarrassed, and embarrassment had sharpened into grievance, and grievance had become the story people told. The ranch hands who had been dismissed without wages, she heard his account of that, told flatly and without self-justification, which was how she knew it was true. He had inherited a payroll situation from his father that was fraudulent, a foreman who had been skimming wages and recording false payments for years. When Abel discovered it, he had confronted the foreman, who had fled, and the records were so tangled that he had spent 18 months in a legal dispute with the county over what was owed and to whom. The men had eventually been paid. They had not told that part of the story. She did not tell him that she was revising the account she had been given of him. She just listened and watched and noticed the gap between what she had been told and what she was learning. But she was not naive. She could see that he was not an easy man. He was solitary in a way that went beyond preference into something that had calcified over years of living alone with difficult decisions. He could be short in conversation when he felt crowded or questioned unfairly, and he had a way of going completely still and cold when something displeased him that she imagined was profoundly disconcerting to people who had not seen the other register of him. He was not warm in the way that Tom Donnelly was warm, the open, uncomplicated warmth of a man who had been well-loved and well-connected his whole life. Abel's warmth was buried deep and had to be worked for, but it was there. She had seen it with the mare. She saw it again in October when she happened to be near the Keene Ranch fence line and watched through the slats as he spent 40 minutes patiently coaxing a young foal to take grain from his hand, speaking to it the whole time in a low, continuous voice, very like the one she had used herself in the ditch. He did not know she was watching. That was important. In November, the weather turned cold faster than anyone expected, and the first hard frost came 2 weeks ahead of its usual time. Mae was walking the Donnelly Road on a Tuesday morning when the sky opened up with the particular cruelty of a blue norther, that Texas specialty in which a hard, cold wind arrives from the north without warning and drops the temperature 30 degrees in an hour. She was caught on the open road in a dress coat that was adequate for Missouri autumn and entirely insufficient for a Texas blue norther, and she had walked perhaps half a mile from town when the cold hit her like a wall. She was still a full mile from the Donnelly Ranch when Abel Keene came riding over the rise from the direction of his property, saw her, and came directly to her without slowing. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, and before Mae could say anything he had stripped off his heavy ranch coat, the kind lined with wool that men who worked outdoors knew to wear, and was putting it around her shoulders. "Your horse," she started, "is fine. He knows his way home." He was already boosting her into the saddle, handling her without ceremony and with complete practicality, which she respected because she was too cold to object to the efficiency. He swung up behind her, took the reins, and turned the horse toward his ranch because it was significantly closer than town in that moment. "You can send word to the Donnellys from my place. Eleanor will understand." Mae was too cold to argue and too warm, suddenly, from the coat and the presence of another person's body heat behind her in the saddle, to want to. She sat straight and kept her hands folded in her lap, and did not let herself lean back against him, even though the temptation was considerable. She stayed at the Keene Ranch for 3 hours while the norther blew itself out. It was the first time she had been inside his house, and she understood immediately that it was the house of a man who had been living alone for too long. It was not dirty. It was not disordered. It was scrupulously clean in the way that spoke of someone who cleaned because it was a necessary task rather than because it gave them pleasure, and it was almost entirely empty of the small objects that accumulated in a lived-in home, the photographs on the mantel, the embroidered cushions, the dried flowers in a cracked pitcher, the 100 small marks that people made on a space when they cared about it and felt welcome in it. There was a table that was clearly made for 6 people. There was one chair pulled up to it. Abel made coffee and put cornbread on the table and sat across from her while she ate, and she watched him trying to remember how to be a host, how to make conversation in a space that clearly saw no conversation, and something about that trying broke something open in her chest that she had been keeping carefully closed. She asked him about the table. He looked at it for a moment, as though he had not really looked at it in a long time. "My father made it," he said. "He made it the year he bought this land, before the house was even finished. Said he wanted the table ready first because a table was where the family happened." He paused. "He had 7 children in his head when he made it. He only got me." "And your sister Ruth," Mae said. "Ruth was born after my mother died. She was raised mostly by my father's second wife, who was a better mother to her than I was a brother. I was already running most of the ranch by the time Ruth was old enough for me to notice her properly." He picked up his coffee cup and turned it in his hands, not drinking. "I have not been as good to people as I should have been. Not Ruth." Not the men who work for me. Not the neighbors. He said it with the flat evenness that she had learned to recognize as his way of delivering a truth he had been sitting with for a long time. I know what they say about me in town. Me looked at him steadily. What do you think of what they say? A long pause. The wind was still high outside, and it made the house creak in a way that was oddly domestic, oddly like the sound of a house that was lived in. I think some of it is earned, he said. I think some of it is not. I think when a person is hard for a long time, people stop being able to see them as anything else, and then it becomes easier to just be what they think anyway. He met her eyes then, and the look was direct and more vulnerable than anything she had seen from him yet. Until recently, I had not thought it mattered. The implication of recently sat between them without either of them touching it. Me walked back to town that afternoon in his coat, which he insisted on lending her for the walk, and she brought it back to the ranch the following morning because returning borrowed things was something she had been raised to do promptly. He was out by the barn when she arrived, working with one of his hands on a wagon wheel that had cracked along the spoke, and he looked up when he heard her footsteps, and the expression that crossed his face before he could contain it was unguarded and genuine, and made her have to look down at the coat in her hands to collect herself. December arrived, and with it the kind of quiet that settled over the Texas plains in winter, a stillness that was different from other seasons' stillness, thicker and more private. Me's work continued. She taught at the schoolhouse. She mended harnesses for a leaner Donnelly. She helped Clementine at the laundry on Tuesdays and Fridays. She was building something in Cassidy Flats, a life that was small but real and entirely her own, and she found that she was grateful for it in a way she had not been grateful for much in a long time. Abel Keene was in that life now, in a way that was hard to account for with precision and harder to ignore. He came to town once a week for supplies, which he had always done, but now the route from the general store to the livery took him reliably past the laundry on the days Me was there, and he had taken to stopping and talking through the open window with a naturalness that would have amused me if it had not also done other things to her. Clementine watched these exchanges with the expression of a woman who was cataloging evidence and would produce her findings in due time. The evening of the first hard snow, Me was sitting with Mrs. Pell by the fire, and Mrs. Pell, who had noticed the same things Clementine had noticed, said without preamble, "You are spending time with Abel Keene." "I am," Me said. There was no point in managing the conversation. Mrs. Pell was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. She was not a cruel woman, and she was not a gossip exactly, though she knew everything that happened in Cassidy Flats. She was a woman who had seen a great deal and who had strong opinions about what she had seen. "He is not a simple man," she said finally. "I know that. He has made a great deal of enemies. I know some of those stories are more complicated than they appear." Another silence. "He was different before his father died," Mrs. Pell said, and her voice was quieter now, less declarative. "I knew him as a boy. He was not easy then either, but he was open in a way. His father's death hit him very hard. They had a falling out the year before, a bad one, something to do with money and a decision Abel made about selling part of the herd that his father never forgave before he died. Abel has carried that for 7 years. Me absorbed this. The shape of Abel Keene became a little clearer, a little more legible. "What was his father like?" she asked. "Demanding," Mrs. Pell said simply. "Good man in many ways, demanding in ways that left a mark." Me thought about the table made for 6. She thought about the one chair pulled up to it. She thought about the face that had gone closed and shutter-like the first moment he saw her, and the face she had seen talking to his foal when he thought no one was watching. "I am not going into anything without my eyes open," she told Mrs. Pell. "I know you are not," Mrs. Pell said. "I am just telling you to keep them open a little longer than you might think you need to." Me nodded, and they sat by the fire and did not speak of it again. It was a week before Christmas when Me went out to the Keene ranch to return a book he had lent her. He had, somewhat unexpectedly, a small but carefully selected library, and had mentioned a volume of accounts about the Texas landscape that she had expressed interest in, and he had simply handed it to her without ceremony the following day. She walked out in the cold mid-morning air, and the sky was clear, and the snow from the previous week was still on the ground, unmelted, giving the whole land a quietness that felt ceremonial. She went around to the back of the house toward the kitchen door, which was the door she had learned he used, and she was perhaps 20 feet away when she heard the sound. She stopped. It was a sound she had not heard from him, a low and painful sound, too controlled to be a cry but unmistakably the sound of a man in grief. The kitchen door was slightly ajar, and through that gap she could see him at the table, at the great table made for 6, sitting in his single chair with his head bowed, and his shoulders bent under some private weight. He was holding something in his hands, a folded piece of paper. From the way he held it, turning it in his fingers without opening it, she understood that he had held it many, many times before. His eyes were wet. She could see that from where she stood, the brightness of suppressed tears in the winter light coming through the kitchen window. And there was something about the sight of this man that 3 counties called the cruelest rancher. This man she had heard described as cold and without feeling. This man who drove people off their land and dismissed his workers, and had no soul worth saving, sitting alone at his dead father's table weeping over a letter he held like it was both precious and burning. That reached inside Mae Underwood and rearranged something fundamental. She stood very still, not wanting to intrude, trying to decide what to do. She could leave. She could set the book on the fence post and leave, and he would never know she had been there, and she could carry this sight away with her privately and never speak of it. But she did not leave. She knocked on the door frame gently and said his name quietly, Abel, and when he looked up at her there was a second, just one unguarded second, in which he did not have time to close his face, and she saw everything. She saw the grief and the isolation and the exhaustion of 7 years of being alone with a guilt that had no remedy. And she saw beneath that, like something preserved under ice, the person he might have been if any of it had gone differently. Then he was on his feet, turning away from her to collect himself, and when he turned back his expression was contained and his voice was level. "Miss Underwood, I did not hear you. I knocked. You did not hear." She lifted the book. "I came to return this." He took it from her and set it on the counter, and the letter was no longer in his hands. She had not seen him put it away, but it was gone now, tucked somewhere, and they both pretended that was perfectly normal. "You walked out in this cold," he said, and his voice was slightly rough in a way that he could not entirely eliminate. "It is not far, and I like the cold." She paused, and then, because she was not a woman who left difficult things lying when they could be addressed, she said quietly, "You do not have to tell me anything, but I am a good listener if you want." He stood very still with his back to the window, and the light made him look like a painting, something about the set of his jaw and the way he was holding himself, as though the structural thing that kept him upright was currently under tremendous pressure. "It is nothing," he said. "It is clearly not nothing." A long silence. "It is a letter," he said finally, "that I wrote to my father, the year before he died after our falling out. I wrote it to try to explain myself. To apologize for the part of it that was mine to apologize for." He stopped. "You did not send it," Mae said. "I did not send it." He looked at the counter where the book sat rather than at her. "I told myself I would wait until the anger had passed, his and mine. And then he got sick very quickly in the way that some men do, and by the time I got to him he could not read anything and could barely speak, and he stopped again, and the word he swallowed was audible in the silence it left. Mae set her coat on the chair near the door and moved to the stove and put the coffee pot on without asking, because it was something to do with her hands and because she understood that in this moment he did not need her to look at him directly. "You never got to give it to him," she said. "I never got to give it to him. And you still carry it. Every day." The simplicity of it was devastating. She turned around and looked at him now, because the moment had passed the point where looking away was kind, and he was looking at her too. And there was something naked and undefended in his face that she had never seen there before, and that she suspected very few people had ever seen. Abel, she said, and the use of his given name without the mister was something she had not done before, and she saw him note it, saw the slight shift in his breathing. Your father knew what was in that letter. He could not have known, he never received it. Fathers know, she said, the same way mothers know, not because they read it, but because you were his son and you loved him even when you were fighting with him and he knew it. That kind of knowing does not require a letter. She did not know if she believed this entirely, or if she said it because she understood he needed it, or both. She did know that it was not false. She had watched enough grief in her life to understand that the things we carry are not always the things the other person needed from us. Sometimes they are just the weight we choose to bear, because it is the only way left to stay connected to someone who is gone. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled the second chair away from its place against the wall and sat down at his own table in a way that looked like a man sitting down for the first time in a very long time, not just on a chair but in his own life. "Sit with me," he said. She sat. They drank coffee at the big table made for six, the two of them in a house that had been empty and silent for years, and the morning light came through the windows and the snow glittered outside, and Abel Keene talked. He talked about his father, about the ranch, about the falling out and what it had been about. It had been about a parcel of land that Abel had sold without his father's permission to cover a debt that his father refused to acknowledge existed. And the money had saved the ranch, but the decision had been a wound between them that neither had known how to close before it was too late. He talked about Ruth in San Antonio, and how he had not visited in 2 years because the drive was long, and the truth was that he did not know how to be easy around people who knew him as a young man and remembered the version of him that existed before everything hardened. Me listened to all of it, and she asked questions when questions seemed useful, and was silent when silence seemed better. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, she was aware that something was shifting in the room, something in the quality of the air between them. "I am sorry about your husband," he said at one point, surprising her because she had mentioned her widowhood once in passing and had not expected him to have retained it or to raise it. "It was a hard time," she said. "He was not a bad man. He was a man who was not very careful with himself, and the fever took him fast. We had not been well suited, if I am honest." "Were you happy?" The directness of the question from him was unexpected, and she thought about it honestly. "I was sometimes content," she said. "I was not often unhappy. That is not the same thing as happy." He nodded as though he understood exactly what she meant. "Have you been happy?" she asked him, returning the directness. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "When I was a boy, riding this land with my father before things went wrong between us, when a horse I have worked with for a long time trusts me completely. And recently," he said and looked at her steadily, "more than I have been in a long time." Me held his gaze, and her heart was doing something complicated and insistent, and she thought about Mrs. Pell saying to keep her eyes open longer than she thought she needed to, and she thought that her eyes were open, and she was seeing him clearly, this difficult and solitary man who carried an unsent letter and wept alone over a table made for a family that had never gathered there, and she thought that what she saw was worth staying for. "I have been happier too," she said quietly. The smile that crossed his face then was something she had never seen from him before. It was not a broad smile, not a wide and easy thing, but it was real, fully and completely real in a way that transformed his whole face, and me thought she would do a great deal to see that smile regularly. Christmas came to Cassidy Flats with a rare warmth, a week of clear skies and mild air that the town took as a gift and celebrated accordingly. There was a gathering at the church hall on Christmas Eve, with music and food and the particular warmth of a small community that knew its own. Me attended with Mrs. Pell and sat with Eleanor Donnelly, who had taken her under her wing in the way that warm-hearted women take in capable, independent women who could use a friend. Abel Keene came. He came alone, as he did everything, and he stood at the edge of the room with his hat in his hand, and the look of a man who was not entirely sure he was welcome but had come anyway, which me understood as its own form of courage. He had dressed carefully. She could see that from across the room, the shirt pressed, the boots cleaned, and the care of it said something about how much it had cost him to walk through that door. She crossed the room to him because it was the right thing to do and because she wanted to, and when she reached him, his expression shifted from guarded uncertainty to something quiet and relieved. "I did not know if you would come," she said. "I thought it was time to try," he said. He looked around the room with careful eyes, taking inventory of expressions, noting who nodded in his direction and who did not. Tom Donnelly crossed to him within 5 minutes and shook his hand with the uncomplicated goodwill that was Tom's natural register, and me watched Abel take that handshake with a gratitude he contained behind his usual restraint. They stood together through most of the evening, and the town watched them, because the town was small and noticed things, and what it noticed was that Abel Keene stood differently when he was next to Mae Underwood. He did not stand differently in a showy way. He stood differently in the way that a held breath, long held, finally releases. Clementine found her way to Me's elbow at one point during the evening and said, very quietly, "I stand corrected on several counts," and moved on before Me could respond, which was its own kind of endorsement. January brought the kind of cold that settled in and stayed, and the work of the ranch and the work of the town continued with the heads-down determination of people who understood that winter was not a season to be argued with. Me's work at the school had grown. The school teacher, a young man from the East who had come to Texas with idealism and insufficient winter clothing, had fallen ill in December, and Me had taken over all 5 days of the school week while he recovered. And then the town had asked her to consider staying on in the position permanently because she was better at it than anyone wanted to admit out loud. She was thinking about it. She was thinking about many things. Abel came to town more frequently in January. He had business at the general store, at the feed merchant, at the county office about a water rights issue that he was trying to resolve amicably rather than legally. A shift in approach that had not gone unnoticed by Tom Donnelly or anyone else who had watched his previous legal strategy. He was also, Me understood, finding reasons to be in the places where she was, and she found this neither alarming nor unwelcome. On a Saturday in mid-January, he drove his wagon into town in the late morning and came to the schoolhouse, where Me was alone working on lesson plans for the following week, and knocked on the open door with a formality that made her want to smile. "I thought if you were not too occupied you might come for a ride," he said. "I want to show you the eastern pasture. The herd is wintering there and the grass has come back in a way I have not seen in years. It is worth seeing." Me looked at her lesson plans and at him and put her pen down. "Give me 10 minutes," she said. They rode out on the 2 best horses from his string, a golden palomino he had saddled for her without asking, and that she took without complaint because it was a beautiful animal, and she had been watching it in his paddock for weeks. They rode east across the snow-patched plains toward the place where the pasture opened up, and when they came over the low rise and she saw what he had brought her to see, she understood why he had wanted to share it. The eastern pasture was alive with cattle in the winter light, hundreds of them moving slowly across the brown and gold grass, their breath rising in small clouds in the cold air, and the whole landscape stretched out around them in the particular vastness of the Texas plains that could make a person feel either tiny or expansive depending on their mood. Today, in this light, with this company, it felt expansive. "It is beautiful," she said simply. He looked at the pasture for a moment with an expression that combined professional assessment with something more personal. "My father loved this piece of land above all the rest of the property. He used to bring me out here when I was very small and tell me that if I took care of the land would take care of me back." A pause. "I have tried to hold to that. I can see that you have." He turned to look at her, and she was looking out at the pasture still, and she felt rather than saw his gaze on the side of her face. "Me," he said, and the way he said her name was different from any previous time, quieter, more deliberate, as though it was something he had been building toward for a while. She turned. "I want to speak plainly to you," he said. "I am not good at the things men are supposed to say in situations like this. I have not had the practice, and I am aware that I am not easy. I know what I am. But I also know that the months since you came to Cassidy Flats have been different from any months I can remember, and I think you know why that is, and I would like to know if you—" He stopped, and the slight roughness in his voice that she had heard the day she found him with the letter was back. "I would like to know if you feel it too." He held his gaze across the distance between their horses, and she thought about everything she knew about him, and everything she did not know, and the ratio between the two. And she thought about a table made for 6 with one chair pulled up to it. And she thought about a letter that had never been sent and had been carried for 7 years. And she thought about a man who had ridden his horse over a field at a full controlled gallop toward his trapped mare with fear plain on his face. "I feel it," she said, quite clearly. He looked at her for a long moment as though he was verifying something, checking the statement against some internal measure. And then he rode his horse the few steps closer to hers and reached out his hand, and she put her hand in it. And they sat there on the rise above the eastern pasture of the Keene ranch with their horses standing close together and the winter sky enormous above them. And it was not a dramatic moment in any external sense, but it was the kind of moment that builds a life on. Which is the most important kind. "I want to do this properly," he said. "I want to court you properly. I want to take you to dinners and to the church gatherings and ride with you and let people see that I am trying to be something better than I have been. And at the end of it, if you are willing, I want to ask you a question." He was looking at her very directly. "I just want you to know where this is heading so that you can decide if that is a direction you are willing to go." Me squeezed his hand. "I know where this is heading," she said. "I have known for some time. Take all the time you need to do it properly. I am not going anywhere." The relief that moved through his face then was something profound and physical, like watching a man set down something very heavy. He did court her properly. He did it with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, which meant he brought her books from his library and discussed them with her seriously. And he drove her to the church gathering in February with his wagon polished, and brought her wild plum preserves from the Donnelly kitchen, because Alina had told him in her direct way that me admired them. And he came to the school on Friday afternoons to walk her home through the cold, because it was a thing he could do that was useful, and she appreciated useful things. He also, in February, wrote a letter to his sister Ruth in San Antonio. He told me about it in the way he was learning to tell her things, not with great preamble but in the middle of other conversation, as though the best way to say something important was to say it while you were also doing something ordinary. They were walking the road back from the Donnelly ranch one afternoon, him leading his horse, and he said, "I wrote to Ruth last week." "I am glad," me said. "I told her about you." She looked at him sideways. "What did you tell her?" "I told her there was a woman in Cassidy Flats who had come from Missouri, and who had saved my best mare from a ditch, and who had made the big table feel less large." He said it with the careful precision of a man quoting himself accurately. "And I told her I thought she should come and meet you." Me was quiet for a moment, walking. "And what did she write back?" He reached into his coat pocket and produced a letter, folded and somewhat worn from rereading, and held it out to her. She took it and unfolded it and read. Ruth Keene, Ruth Mosley now. Her married name at the bottom, wrote in a hand that was quick and warm, and not very like her brother's in its expression at all. She wrote that Abel had not told her about a woman in 7 years of letters, not once, and that this was therefore clearly serious, and that she and her husband Marcus would be happy to visit in the spring, and could me please write to her directly because she had approximately 47 questions that she could not trust Abel to answer accurately. Me laughed, and Abel looked at her with the pleased expression of a man who had done something right. "She sounds wonderful," Mae said, handing the letter back. She is the best of us." He tucked the letter away. "She will like you. She likes people who are honest and who are not impressed by me." "I am somewhat impressed by you," Mae said mildly. He turned and looked at her, and the smile that crossed his face was the real one, the one that had been worth waiting for, and she thought again, as she had been thinking with increasing frequency, that she was very glad she had heard that mare calling from the road and had not kept walking. March arrived with the first warmth of coming spring, and the land around Cassidy Flats began the slow and beautiful process of turning from brown and gold to green. Mae had accepted the permanent school teaching position, which meant she was staying in Cassidy Flats, which she had already known she was doing, but which the formal acceptance made real in a new way. She moved from Mrs. Pell's rooming house into a small house at the edge of town that the school board rented to its teacher 2 rooms, a stove, a porch that looked west toward the plains, and a garden space where she immediately planned a kitchen garden. Abel helped her move her things, which did not take long because she did not have many things, and when the moving was done, he stood in the small main room of her house looking around at her possessions arranged in the space. Her mother's Bible on the windowsill, a small framed photograph of the Missouri River, her books arranged neatly on the shelf he had built and hung for her the previous week, and the expression on his face was one she had come to recognize as his version of contentment. "It looks like you," he said. "Is that good?" "Yes," he said, and there was no ambiguity in it. He had also, in March, done something about the creek crossing. He had ridden to the Donnelly Ranch and spoken to Tom Donnelly and reopened the shared crossing, formally and in writing, with a fair agreement about use and maintenance that Tom had shaken his hand over twice. Word of this spread through town, as words always did, and Mae heard it from Clementine, who reported it with a satisfaction that was not entirely concealed. "That man is changing," Clementine said, not to me specifically but in her general direction. Or maybe just showing what was always under there. Mae thought about the letter that had never been sent, still in his pocket wherever he kept it now. She thought it was both. April brought Ruth and Marcus mostly up from San Antonio on the stage, and the meeting Mae had been slightly nervous about turned out to be the opposite of difficult. Ruth Keene mostly was 30 years old, with her brother's dark eyes but none of his containment. She was quick and bright and talked at a wonderful rate, and found me within 10 minutes of arriving, and immediately confirmed that she had indeed approximately 47 questions, which she proceeded to ask across the dinner table at Abel's ranch while Marcus Mosley, a quiet and good-humored man who clearly adored his wife, ate his food, and observed the proceedings with benign interest. Abel sat at the head of the great table made for 6, and Mae sat across from Ruth, and Marcus was beside me, and there were 2 chairs still empty at the end of the table, and Abel did not seem to notice the empty chairs in the way he once had. He was watching his sister and me talk, and the expression on his face was the soft and unguarded one that Mae had decided was the most true version of his face, the one that belonged to who he was underneath everything that had accrued over the years. Ruth caught her brother looking at me and looked at me and then looked at Mae's hands and said, with the directness that was clearly a family trait, "You should know, Mae, that I have been waiting for someone like you for a very long time. I was beginning to think my brother was going to spend his entire life alone at that enormous table and slowly turn into the furniture." "Ruth," Abel said. "I am stating facts," Ruth said, unmoved. Mae laughed, and Abel looked pained, and Marcus refilled everyone's coffee with the practiced ease of a man who had learned that the best thing to do when Ruth was on a subject was to ensure everyone had sufficient refreshment for the duration. That night after dinner, after Ruth and Marcus had gone to their room and the dishes were done, Abel walked me back toward town through the spring dark. The night was warm for April, and the stars were enormous, and the air smelled of the grass coming back to life after winter. They were halfway to town when he stopped, and she stopped with him, and the night was quiet around them. "I have something to ask you," he said. Mae looked up at him. The starlight was enough to see by barely, and she could see the set of his jaw and the particular stillness of him that preceded important things. "I know I am not easy," he said. "I know I have made mistakes that I am still undoing. I know there are people in this town who will take time to come around and some who may not come around at all. I know the ranch is demanding and the winters are hard and the table is very large for 2 people, but I would like to not eat alone at it anymore." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me. I am asking if you will stay." She looked at him under the enormous Texas sky. This man she had met in a ditch over a trapped horse. This man who had been called the cruelest rancher in 3 counties. This man who had wept over a letter he had never sent, and who had made her coffee in his empty house, and told her the truth about himself without flinching. This man who had walked beside her on the road, and opened the creek crossing and written to his sister, and come to the Christmas gathering with his hat in his hand and tried. "I have already stayed," she said. "Yes, Abel, yes." He let out a breath that had been in him for a long time, and then he did something she had not entirely expected, which was that he reached out and cupped her face in both his large, work-rough hands with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with everything his hands had spent their life doing, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression that was completely open, nothing held back, all of it visible, and then he kissed her. And the Texas spring night wrapped around them, and the stars were outrageous above them, and me thought that she had been a long time finding this, and was going to appreciate it thoroughly. They were married in June, in the Cassidy Flats church, on a morning when the sky was the particular shade of blue that she had noticed on her very first walk to the Keene property, and that she had decided must be the specific color of Texas in good weather. Mrs. Pell sat in the front pew, and cried with the unself-conscious emotion of a woman who had earned the right to feel satisfied about how things had turned out. Clementine Hayes sat beside her, and did not cry but wore her best dress, and a very composed expression that was undermined by the brightness of her eyes. Tom and Alina Donnelly sat 3 rows back, and Alina was already planning the wedding supper that she had volunteered to host without anyone asking her. Ruth and Marcus had come back up from San Antonio for the occasion, and Ruth stood beside me as her witness, and handed her the flowers she had gathered from the spring pasture of the Keene ranch that morning, wild plum blossoms and Indian paintbrush, and the small white flowers whose name me had not learned yet, but whose beauty she had admired every time she rode across the eastern pasture. Abel stood at the front of the church in his best coat, which me had quietly pressed and repaired at the laundry the week before, because she was a practical woman, and when she came down the aisle he looked at her the way she had been looking at him for months, openly and without containment, as though the long practice of keeping things interior had finally and completely surrendered. The Reverend, who had once told someone that Abel Keene had no soul worth saving, married them with what seemed to me like genuine emotion. Perhaps because the Reverend was not without his own capacity to revise a position, or perhaps because, in a small town, a wedding is one of the great occasions and calls forth the best of whoever is presiding. "I, Abel Keene, take you, Mae Underwood, to be my wife," he said, and his voice was steady and low and entirely serious, and me thought that she had never heard her own name sound so much like something being taken care of. After the wedding there was the supper at the Donnellys, long and warm and abundant with food that Alina had been planning for weeks, and the whole town seemed to be there, or most of it, and there was music and dancing, and Abel danced with me in the way that a man dances when he knows he is not good at dancing, but is willing to try because the person in his arms is worth the attempt. At one point in the evening, me saw him standing near the door with Tom Donnelly, the 2 of them talking with the ease of men who had found their way to something like friendship through the patience of their wives, and Tom said something that made Abel really laugh, with his head thrown back and his whole chest in it. And it was such an unfamiliar sound, and such a full one that several people turned to look, and me saw Mrs. Pell catch her eye from across the room and give her a very small nod. The summer that followed was the best me could remember. She taught school through the final weeks of the term, and then had June and July to herself, and she spent those months at the ranch with Abel, learning the rhythms of the land and the work in the full detail that she had only observed from a distance before. She rode out with him in the early mornings, in the hour before dawn that he had always loved, and she learned to love it too, the quality of the light as it built in the east, the way the cattle were still, and the horses were quiet, and the whole enormous land was holding its breath before the day began. She planted her kitchen garden in a patch near the ranch house, where the soil was rich from years of composted material, and the garden grew with the generosity of good Texas soil beans and squash and tomatoes and herbs that she had started from seed in the schoolhouse window during the winter. The ranch hands, who had watched the arrival of Mrs. Keene with the cautious curiosity of men who had worked for a solitary employer and were not sure what to make of a changed situation, warmed to her at approximately the same rate at which the garden grew, and by August, the cook who managed the bunkhouse meals was consulting her on provisions, and the hand who managed the horses had begun meeting her in the paddock in the mornings to talk about the foals. Abel watched all of this with the same careful attention he brought to the land, and with the same quality she had identified in him from the beginning, the capacity for deep, sustained appreciation for things that were good. He also did something that she had not expected, and that moved her more than she could comfortably say. One evening in July he came in from the fields later than usual, and she was at the table in the kitchen with her lesson planning and a cup of tea, and he sat down across from her in the second chair, the one he now used as naturally as if he had always sat there, and he put the letter on the table. She looked at it and then at him. "I want to bury it," he said. "Under the tree by the eastern pasture, the oak. My father planted it the year he bought the land." He paused. "I have been carrying it long enough, and I think." He stopped and she waited. "I think you were right. I think he knew. I think I knew what was in it and he knew what was in it, and the only person it has kept apart from him is me, carrying it." Me put her hand over his on the table. "I think so too. Will you come with me?" They rode out to the eastern pasture the following morning in the early quiet, and they buried the letter under the oak tree that his father had planted 30 years before, wrapped in oilcloth against the soil, and Abel stood with his hand on the rough bark of the tree for a long moment with his eyes closed, and me stood beside him and did not speak, and the morning light came up across the pasture and turned everything gold. When he turned back from the tree his eyes were bright, but this time his face was not bent with grief. He looked like a man who had set something down and found, to his surprise, that he could stand straight without it. "Thank you," he said. "You did that yourself," she said. "I just came along." He shook his head slightly with a small smile. "No," he said, "you are the reason I could do it at all." Ruth came again in September, this time without Marcus, who had business he could not leave, and she stayed for 3 weeks, and the 3 weeks transformed the ranch house in ways that were difficult to specify but entirely real. Ruth's presence filled rooms in a way that required rooms to be occupied and used, and me found herself using the parlor, a room that had been closed and sheeted for years, and discovered it contained a piano under the sheets that had not been played since Abel's mother's time. "Can you play?" Ruth asked, lifting the sheets off it with the unsentimental practicality of someone who had grown up knowing the piano was there and had been waiting for someone to uncover it. "A little. I learned as a girl." "It has been years." "A little is more than Abel can manage. He is entirely without music, I'm afraid," Ruth said, with the fond dismissiveness of a younger sister. Me sat at the piano that evening and played, haltingly at first, then better as her hands remembered what her mind had half forgotten, and Abel stood in the doorway of the parlor and listened with an expression that was the particular openness of someone hearing music that they have not heard in a very long time in a place where it has been a very long time absent. "Mother used to play," he said when she had stopped. "I know," Mae said. "Ruth told me." He came and sat beside her on the piano bench, which was not designed for two adults but accommodated them if they sat close, which they did. And Mae played the simple pieces she could remember, and Abel was quiet beside her. And Ruth sat in the armchair across the room and pretended to be reading, but was watching them with her chin in her hand and an expression of deep satisfaction. In October, Mae knew she was expecting their child, and she told Abel on a Tuesday evening, simply and directly, because that was how she told things. He was at the kitchen table going over the ranch accounts, and she came and stood across from him and said, "Abel, we are going to have a baby." He went very still in the way he did before important things, and then he stood up and she stood her ground, and he crossed the table to her in 2 steps and put his arms around her with a thoroughness that said more than anything he could have spoken. "When?" he managed after a moment. "May, I think. Maybe early June." He pulled back to look at her face, his hands still on her shoulders, and she saw the fullness of what he was feeling clearly in his face, all of it. The happiness and the weight of it, and the gratitude and the mild terror that attended such announcements in every human being who had ever received them. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Somewhat tired in the mornings and very hungry in the evenings, but perfectly well." He looked at her for another moment, and then he said, quietly, as though he were speaking to himself as much as to her, "I need to be good at this." "You will be," Mae said. "You are already good at taking care of things. You are good at taking care of the land and the horses and the cattle. You are good at taking care of me. A child is different." "Yes. But you are the kind of person who learns what is needed and does it. That is most of being a good father, Abel. The rest is showing up every day." He looked at her steadily, and she could see him turning this over, testing it against his knowledge of himself and finding it not implausible. "I wrote my father letters," he said, "when things were good between us, when I was young, before everything." He paused. "I want to be the kind of father who does not need a letter because he is present every day." Mae put her hand on his face. "That is the right want," she said. "Hold on to it." He covered her hand with his and turned his face very slightly into her palm. And there, in the warm kitchen of the house that had been empty for too long, Mae Underwood Keene felt with absolute certainty that she was where she was supposed to be, with the person she was supposed to be with. And that life, which had not been particularly gentle with her up to this point, had arrived at something real and lasting and good. Winter of 1882 had brought her to Cassidy Flats with $11 and a carpetbag. The winter of 1883 found her in a house that had rooms that were lived in, and a piano that was played, and a table that was full, a husband who had learned to sit at it without heaviness, and a life growing inside her that would, the following May, become a son. They named him James Henry Keene, James for Mae's father the farrier, and Henry for Abel's father, because Abel decided in the nights before the birth that the name his father had given to this ranch, and to him should not stop there, and that carrying it forward in the name of his child was a better way to honor a complicated man than any other he could think of. Mae agreed, because she thought he was right, and because she had learned to trust the decisions Abel made when he made them from the deepest and best part of himself, which was where this one came from. James Henry Keene was born on the 14th of May, 1883, on a warm spring morning, and he was large and loud and immediately opinionated, which Abel accepted with equanimity and Mae accepted with recognition, because she understood that opinionated was a family trait on both sides. Ruth and Marcus came again for the birth, which meant Ruth had come again, because Marcus had the wisdom to stay a respectful distance from the actual event, but to arrive in time to hold his nephew and declare him the finest-looking child he had personally encountered, which Mae thought was generous and Abel thought was accurate. Abel held his son for the first time on the afternoon of his birth, sitting in the rocker that Eleanor Donnelly had sent over from town, and the expression on his face was not one that Mae could fully describe, not in any language she had access to. It was not the same as any other expression she had seen from him. It was its own thing, original to this moment, the expression of a man who has arrived at a place he did not know he was traveling toward and found it to be the exact shape of something he has always needed. He looked up at her over the head of his son and said, "Thank you," and it was directed at her, but it was also, she thought, directed at a lot of other things, at the road from Missouri and the mare in the ditch and the cold norther and the Christmas gathering and the letter buried under the oak, at all the small and specific accumulation of events that had made this moment possible. "We did that together," Mae said. "Yes," he said, "we did." The years that followed were not without difficulty, because years without difficulty are not years. They are stories told backwards from a comfortable chair. There was a dry summer in 1884 that tested the herd, and tested their resources and tested Abel's acquired equanimity, in ways that the early version of him would have met with cold fury, and the current version of him met with methodical problem-solving, and on the worst evenings, with me beside him on the porch in the dark, talking through what could be done and what could not be changed. There was a dispute with a new neighbor who bought the land to the north and came in with aggressive intent about water rights that felt terribly familiar, and Abel went to the county office and handled it legally and without theater, and it was resolved in a way that was fair to both properties. And the new neighbor, a man named Breckett, became neither a friend nor an enemy but a reasonable acquaintance, which was a satisfactory outcome. There was the year that Ruth and Marcus had their first child, a daughter they named Clara, and they brought her to visit the Keene ranch that spring. And James, who was 2 years old and unsteady in his walking but entirely confident in his opinions, immediately took an interest in his infant cousin that was both proprietary and tender, which Ruth found hilarious and Abel found completely understandable. Mae continued teaching school. She had been offered the position permanently, and she took it permanently, and she went about the business of teaching the children of Cassidy Flats to read and write, and to think about the world beyond their immediate horizon with the same brisk, effective competence she brought to everything. Several of her students, over the years, would go on to schooling further afield than any Cassidy Flats child had managed before, and she would feel a particular satisfaction about this that she would carry quietly and without announcement. In 1885, their second child arrived, a daughter this time, born in October with her mother's coloring and her father's serious dark eyes and an early disposition toward watching everything carefully before committing to an opinion, which both her parents found extremely recognizable. They named her Clara Ruth Keene, Clara for Marcus and Ruth's daughter who had charmed them all, and Ruth for the aunt who had written to me with 47 questions and had asked them all and been satisfied by the answers. Abel, who had been told by several well-meaning people in the months before Clara's birth that having a daughter was different from having a son, found this to be true in ways he had not anticipated. He was, from very early, thoroughly in her power in a way that James observed with the philosophical acceptance of an older sibling who has seen the parental ecosystem shift and adapted accordingly. Mae watched this with great affection and refrained from commenting except in private, where she told Abel that he was completely transparent and that it was one of the better things about him. "I am not transparent," he said. "Abel," she said, with patience. "You spent 40 minutes yesterday explaining to a 3-month-old how to assess the quality of grass in a spring pasture. She was interested," he said. "She was asleep. She was listening in her sleep." Mae kissed him on the cheek, which was her response to arguments she found too charming to properly correct. The table made for 6 no longer felt large. With James in his chair and Clara in the high chair that Abel had built with the same care his father had put into the table itself, and with the occasional addition of Ruth and Marcus and Clara cousin when they visited, and the steady Sunday presence of Tom and a leaner Donnelly who had become as close as family, the table was full more often than not. Mrs. Pell came to dinner once a month, because Mae had made a habit of it and Abel had seconded the habit, because he understood that Mrs. Pell was, in her way, part of the architecture of his present happiness. One Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1886, Mae was sitting on the porch of the ranch house, while Abel and Tom Donnelly sat on the steps talking about the fall roundup, and James was running in circles in the yard with the particular purposeless joy of a 3-year-old, and Clara was in her arms, awake and looking at the sky with the serious attention she brought to everything, and the air smelled of turned earth and the first hint of the coming cold. And the land stretched out in every direction, with the bigness that Mae had never stopped finding extraordinary. Abel looked back at her from the steps, across the yard, through the afternoon light, and the look that passed between them was the kind that does not require any particular expression, because it is made of something that sits beneath expression, the daily accumulated certainty of two people who have found each other and built something real together. He turned back to Tom, and Mae shifted Clara in her arms and looked out at the land, and James came running up to the porch with something cupped in his small hands that he wanted to show her, and she bent down to look at it with the full attention that children deserve, and the October sun was warm on her shoulders, and everything that had been empty was full, and everything that had been silent was filled with the sound of a life being lived completely. The letter under the oak tree in the eastern pasture had gone back to the earth, as all things did, as grief did when it was given space to go, as the hardness in a man did when he was given something worth being soft for. The table made for 6 had been made for this. Abel's father, who had built it before the house was finished because he believed the table was where the family happened, had built it for exactly this. Mae Underwood, who had arrived in Cassidy Flats with $11 and a carpetbag and a broken-down marriage behind her and the whole uncertain West ahead, had not known any of this when she followed the sound of a horse calling from the road. She was glad she had not kept walking. She was glad every single day. And Abel Keene, who had been told and told and told by 3 counties that he was the cruelest man they knew, sat at his father's table in the evenings with his wife beside him and his children nearby, and the lamp burning warm against the Texas dark. And he was, in the deep and earned and specific way that difficult things become true, happy. Not the uncomplicated happiness of men who had never been tested, not the easy contentment of those who had never had to dismantle themselves and build something better in the rubble, but the happiness of a man who knows exactly what he has and exactly what it costs to get here and holds it accordingly, with both hands, with his whole attention, every day. That was the kind that lasted. That was the kind that was real. And out in the eastern pasture, under the oak his father had planted, where the grass came back every spring greener than the year before, the letter rested quietly in the good Texas soil, and above it the cattle moved slowly through the gold and morning light, and the land took care of itself the way it always had, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.